everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of my Healing Hot Girl books. These are books that I think are perfect for journal prompt inspiration. If you haven't watched the first part of this video, then I will link it down below. I showed a handful of books in that video that focused pretty much on internal work, and even though this segment still involves internal work, it seeps out more into systemic issues and relationships like friendships and romantic partners, family, things like that. So this is definitely more about your inner circle along with other larger systems that end up impacting you as an individual. So I want to go off of that and just say that these books are really great for journal prompt inspiration, and I think journaling is such an amazing summer activity, all year round activity to be honest, but I do plan to journal a lot on the beach and during vacation with my friends, at the park, doing a little picnic. So I think it's such a perfect hot girl activity, and it's definitely very healing and comforting. So let's get on with the books. First up, we have Decolonizing Wellness by Dalia, Kinsey. And if you're not familiar with the term decolonization, it basically refers to the process of undoing colonialism and the residual effects of colonialism. So it's no secret that colonialism has impacted virtually every aspect of our lives, including wellness. So this book definitely centers around body image or self-image, the diet culture in society, eating, and self-love practices. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend this book. I also recommend it to anyone who is constantly on social media or has a very large social media presence, consumes a lot of media, because the wellness industry and all those topics I just mentioned are so prevalent in social media and online today. So I definitely recommend this book. It's very short. It's a pretty easy read, very simple and straightforward to follow. This is how I tabbed it. As you can see, I tabbed quite a few things. I basically just used a purple colored tab for any memorable quotes or important information that I want to remember and look back on. And then the yellow tabs are for the journaling breaks. So in between the chapters, there are a list of questions, and you can write directly on the book, which is what I did, but there's actually not that much space to write. There's only a couple lines underneath each question. So if you feel like you want to write more, I do recommend getting a separate notebook and journaling and answering those questions on there. So this is an example of what the page looks like. I don't know if you can see because the light is reflecting, but there are different questions and you can answer it directly on here. What's nice is that you can read the book and journal as you read it, or you can just read the whole thing and then look at the questions and journal in a separate notebook or on this book after you read everything else. So it depends on you and your pace, but I also really like the fact that there are resources at the end of the book. So there are podcast recommendations, book recommendations, websites you can visit that also talk about the topics that are mentioned in this book. Next up, we have Consumed by Aja Barber. I mentioned this in a previous video on books that helped me stop shopping fast fashion. So this is one of the books that definitely shifted the way I thought about my consumption habits, specifically with clothing, which is one of the main things that I spend my money on. But in other words, I would say that this book helped me heal my attachment to clothing and consumption. And it definitely broke my shopping addiction. And I feel very happy in the place that I am now with my consumption habits and where I decide to shop, how often I decide to shop, and sort of my thinking process for when I do choose to purchase a clothing item. So there are some questions in this book. They're very little, but overall, this is one of those books that has sort of rhetorical questions throughout the book and just really deep insights that make you reflect on your own consumption habits, especially if you are a big clothing addict. But on page 219, there is an urge and purge exercise, and there are a list of questions on the following page. I wrote directly in the book, but again, you can write in a separate journal if you have more to say, because there isn't much space in the book. So some of the questions ask, how would you be happier if you stopped purging on fast fashion? Another question is, have you ever lied about the amount of clothing you were buying? I also just really like how this book is structured. I mentioned in my previous video that it does get a little messy, especially towards the end, but I like the structure in the sense that it has like the little quotes boxed in like that, and there are also little boxes like this to highlight a specific topic. But in terms of explicit questions, there's not that many. So I would definitely say that this is a book that puts you in a deep mode of reflection on your consumption habits, especially with clothing. And that is something to think about. And even just reading the book, you can probably generate questions of your own to write in your journal. Next up, we have Set Boundaries, Find Peace by Nedra Tawwab. And if you can't tell by the title, this book is about boundaries. So let's go to the table of contents. So part 1 talks about the importance of boundaries, what they are, different types of boundaries. And the second part of the book talks about setting boundaries in different aspects of your life. So it talks about family, romantic relationships, friendships, work, social media, and technology. So I thought the social media and technology part was also very important in this day and age. But I love the way this book is organized overall. It makes it very clear and easy to find certain topics. For example, there's a lot of numbering and a lot of bullet points right here, like boundaries for enmeshment, talks about tips on oversharing, examples of trauma bonding, and they're all laid out very neatly in bullet points. So after each chapter, there is an exercise. So for example, in the part about romantic relationships, there's an exercise that asks you to grab a journal and answer the following questions. So there are 2 sections. If you're single, ask yourself these questions, and there's a list of questions. And then the other section says if you're in a relationship, ask yourself these questions. There's another list of questions. So I really enjoy that there are different questions for each chapter, usually at the end of the chapter, but there are also questions that can be found throughout the chapter. So for example, in this same segment about romantic relationships, there are questions that you can ask your partner and communicate to one another. So it's not necessarily about journaling, or you can journal together and write it out together as a couple. So I think that's really neat that everything is organized in that way. For example, this section says pure communication is the leading cause of divorce and breakups. So it lists a number of topics and questions underneath it to really clearly communicate to your partner what it is you guys are thinking about and really just be on the same page. There are some really good questions in here, and what I've done is I pretty much copy and paste the questions that I feel like I would want to answer or that are applicable to me, and then I put them in a document. I mentioned this in the previous video, but I like to just have it easily accessible on my phone, and I can just whip it out anytime I feel like journaling. It's overall just such a well-organized book. It's very clear, straightforward. It makes understanding boundaries and setting boundaries seem very simple, but I do wish that the author expanded more on actually like honoring and respecting your boundaries, because that part involves a lot of self-respect and discipline. And I get it, this is more like a guide because there are so many questions. It's organized in such a way that it just gives you information very clearly, which I still appreciate. Guys, I realized I was going off of the order of how I stacked my books and not the order of how I wanted to actually present the books in the video, but we only have 2 books left, so let's go with Attached. This was supposed to be the first book I wanted to mention in this video, but too late. Anyways, this book is by Amir, Levine, and Rachel S.F. Heller. So as you can tell by the title, this book is about attachment styles and attachment theory. And I think this is a book that is especially useful for people with anxious and avoidant attachment styles like myself. So as I was reading this book, I honestly kept marking in the margins like, me, this is so me, this is definitely me, kept underlining multiple times, circling things, exclamation points, because I really related to this book, and it definitely called me out in a good way, a very constructive way. And it made me realize and reflect that I wanted to be a secure person, especially in a relationship. So this is definitely a book that's a mixture of explicit questions that you can answer in your journal, but also just putting you in such a deep state of self-awareness and self-reflection. And from there, you can generate your own questions. So the explicit questions that they have, for example, on 168, there's a relationship inventory. It's basically just a giant table where you answer questions and you go through every relationship you've been. But you can copy this entire table and write it in a separate journal, or you can just write it directly on the book. But there are questions following up, summarizing your inventory, as well as examples of relationship inventories. I also find that these little shaded boxes that are all throughout this book are really great ways to think about your own behaviors in the past and reflect on those. And from there, you can probably generate some questions to ask yourself that are very highly specific to your own life and your own personal journey. I recommend this to practically anyone, because attachment styles are applicable to platonic relationships as well. So not just your romantic partners, but also how you attach yourselves to your friendships and family members. But in the context of relationships, I definitely see myself reflecting back on my previous one and journaling that throughout the summer to make sure I really heal in a healthy way. And I think this book is a great tool for my healing journey. Lastly, we have How to Not Die Alone by Logan Ury. And I also really like this book because it called me out as well. There is a section about attachment styles here, and I think she does kind of mention the attachment styles here and there throughout the book, but I love the way this is organized. It's definitely more like a guide. There are questions and exercises throughout the chapter, and then at the end of each chapter there is a summary that lists all the key takeaways. As you can see, the shaded parts in gray, those are places you can jot down your thoughts, your insights, your ideas, your responses. Throughout the book there are these shaded little boxes, and those are basically exercises that you can write in. So for example, this one says, write out what truly matters to you, what are your actual deal breakers, what are your pet peeves, and what are your nice to haves. So she defines those in the chapter, but as you go through the whole book, there are those shaded boxes where you can write directly on the book. I really enjoyed chapter 15, which is how to make a breakup plan, basically how to break up with someone. And what's so funny is, like, I didn't actually read this when I was doing this, but now looking back at it, I was like, oh, I kind of already absorbed that information and took what I got from this book, and I did sort of apply that to my real life without consciously knowing it. So in that chapter, there are the shaded gray little boxes, and they have different exercises. For example, this exercise says, record your reasons for the breakup. So it asks you to grab a notebook and write yourself a letter explaining why you're making the decision to break up. And there are different steps here as well, like setting a clear deadline for when to do it, and committing to a specific and thoughtful time to communicate to the other person, and other exercises like this, which includes a ton more questions that you can journal about. And it also goes into post-breakup stuff. So it says, explore the deeper meaning behind the relationship. What did you learn from the relationship? What did you learn from the breakup? There are definitely a lot of journaling opportunities throughout this book. And I also like the way it's organized, easy to follow, easy to understand, especially with the summaries at the end of each chapter. I think there is something to take out of this book something for everyone. So if you're single or not, I think it's still a really great book to read. I read this when I wasn't single, so I still very much enjoyed it, and I think I want to reread it again, and now that I am single, so this will be exciting to reread. That concludes part 2 of the Healing Hot Girl books that are perfect for journal prompt inspiration. I'm so excited for summer. I'm actually bringing a journal with me to Europe for my vacation because why not? I have the questions on my phone, like I said, and I just want to journal whenever I have the time, like on the plane or at the beach or just in my hotel room. After I post this video, I'm gonna be uploading some European summer content. So packing my luggage and also just travel prep before I leave. So that's all gonna be after this video. So stay tuned for that and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.